I very much would like to welcome all those participants who have logged in from all over the world to this meeting, which the Socialist Equality Party has called to celebrate and mark the life and contribution of Comrade Barry Jobson. My name is Cheryl Crisp, I'm the National Secretary of the SEP, and I will be chairing today's meeting. Barry Andrew Jobson was born on June the 26th, 1942, and was part of a generation given life in the midst of the most barbaric event in world history, World War II. He died on December the 11th, 2020, at 78 years of age, having dedicated more than half his life to the fight for the socialist transformation of society as one of the most conscious, principled, and self-sacrificing representatives of that generation. The new generations of young people and workers who will comprise the coming explosive and revolutionary struggles of the working class against capitalism will turn to the life and example of Barry Jobson for inspiration and leadership. The horror of World War II, 70 million dead, twice as many civilians as soldiers, the carpet and firebombing of entire cities, the attempt to exterminate entire peoples, haunt the collective memory of mankind. Terms like Nazi, genocide, Auschwitz, Hiroshima, concentration camps, final solution, Holocaust, and atomic bomb, which became part of the lexicon of the time, are forever associated with the greatest slaughter ever to be inflicted on mankind, the real face of capitalism. While the war ended in 1945, nothing was ever the same for those who lived through it, and they were profoundly affected in so many ways. They would instill in their children a revulsion to war, an opposition to it, and a determination that it would never happen again. The fact that 75 years since the end of World War II, fascist thugs are rampaging through the corridors of the Capitol building in Washington, the seat of bourgeois democracy in the United States, must be a profound warning to the international working class. One wore a t-shirt emblazoned with Camp Auschwitz. Underneath that, the words, "Work brings freedom," the same slogan that the Nazis placed at the entrance to the death camps. Another flying the Confederate flag, which until January the 6th had never been raised inside the Capitol building. QAnon placards, a makeshift gallows and noose, and other various extreme right-wing fascistic sentiments being espoused, all incited and encouraged and mobilised by the President of the United States. One thing this reveals is that nothing was resolved by World War II, and all the contradictions which led to it have re-emerged in the most sharp and dangerous form. The fact that the Morrison government in Australia has refused to condemn Trump or the attempted coup must also be a warning that this is not an American phenomena alone. This memorial meeting takes place in the midst of the greatest crisis of capitalism since the Second World War. A virus which was predictable and predicted by epidemiologists and doctors and scientists almost 2 decades ago has raged unchecked throughout the vast expanse of the world, leaving in its wake almost 100 million infections and over 2 million dead. It is incontrovertible that these figures are understated. As early as last October, Dr. Mike Ryan, the World Health Organization's Health Emergencies Program Executive Director, predicted that 10% of the world's population had indeed been infected up until then. While the virus, as we know, is highly contagious and deadly, the staggering toll is not the result only of the virus, but of the policies and decisions of governments in every country. The International Committee of the Fourth International and the World Socialist website has characterised the pandemic as a trigger event, analogous with the outbreak of World War I in 1914. The decisions governments made were based consciously on economic considerations, that lives will be sacrificed on the altar of profit. There is a very direct relationship between the pandemic and the homicidal policy of herd immunity achieved by allowing the virus to run rampant and the turn by the ruling class to dictatorial forms of rule. The protests and rallies organised through 2020 by Trump and his supporters were centred on opposition to any measures to contain the virus, opposing the closure of non-essential factories, schools, universities and workplaces, because that would affect profit. And as the death toll rises to record levels on an almost daily basis, so do to the fortunes of those on Wall Street. Elon Musk of Tesla has seen his wealth increase by $165 billion in the last year alone to become the wealthiest person on the planet. He is one of the 500 richest people who now control more than $10 trillion. How many lives could have been saved had that wealth been used for hospitals, nurses, doctors, financial support for workers in factories forced into lockdown, schools, workplaces who couldn't work? These staggering and unsustainable levels of inequality cannot be maintained peacefully. The rise of the military, police, National Guards, intelligence services is bound up with the attempt to deal with the US rivals, but also, most importantly, against its most feared enemy, the American working class. And while there may be sharp and at times bloody differences within the ruling elite, there is unanimity between the Democrats and the Republicans on the necessity to ensure the opposition of the working class to these murderous policies, that they do not take place outside the control of the Democrats, the DSA, the trade unions, and the pseudo-lefts like the ISO. They have all responded by either denying there was an attempted coup or downplaying and mocking it. These experiences have unalterably transformed the consciousness of millions of people. Life will never be the same again, and the thinking of masses will never be the same. It is clear to the multi-millioned masses in the advanced capitalist countries and the developing countries alike that they cannot rely on their governments to defend them against a virus, let alone advance their lives. Unemployment has reached levels in almost every country not experienced since the 1930s. Poverty, homelessness, hunger and starvation, the scourge once associated predominantly with poorer countries, is now rife throughout the richest countries in the world. There is a growing internationalisation of life, of the peoples of the world, whether in rich or poor countries. There will be no snapback to life as existed prior to the pandemic, even if the vaccines prove effective in the unlikely event that its distribution is enacted effectively. Life has changed. In World War I, the overriding conception was that the war would be over by Christmas, but it wasn't. It dragged on year after year with the death toll rising and rising exponentially. It became apparent that the slaughter of millions of young men, the flower of the rising generation, was a price the capitalist class was more than willing to pay. It required the active intervention of the working class most starkly in the overthrow of capitalism through the Russian Revolution of 1917 to bring that great war, as it's called, to an end. Not because the ruling class had changed, but because the fear that other countries would go down the path of Russia. It is that task which confronts the working class today. Biden, the Democrats, have no different policy on the pandemic to Trump. There will be no lockdown or shift in policy to save lives. Unless the working class carries out its own independent response based on a revolutionary socialist perspective, it will be forced to accede to the demands of the fascists and the perspective of growing sections of the ruling class that are turning towards these fascist layers. It is the Revolutionary Party, the ICFI, that can and only can provide the political direction and perspective to lead that struggle. It is that perspective that Comrade Barry committed his energy, his talents, his patience to ensuring the working class was able to carry through its historical task, the overthrow of capitalism and the establishment of a socialist society. This afternoon, we have 3 speakers to present contributions and to discuss Barry's role and the historical and political context in which he made it. After the speakers, we will open for questions and any other comments which members of our audience may like to present. And we will also have an appeal for our monthly fund. Our first speaker is Comrade Nick Beams. While he is, of course, no stranger to you, I will introduce him nevertheless. Comrade Nick is a founding member of the Socialist Labour League, the precursor of the SEP, the Australian section of the ICFI, which was founded 49 years ago in April. Nick served as the National Secretary of the SLL and the Socialist Equality Party for 30 years. He is well known and a much followed writer on the World Socialist website, particularly concentrating on Marxist economics. I am very pleased to welcome Comrade Nick to you.
Thank you, Cheryl, and I'd like to extend my greetings to all of the participants today. It is indeed an honour to be able to speak at this memorial meeting for Comrade Barry Jobson. The significance of his life and his struggle for the program and principles of the World Trotskyist movement within the working class, the imperishable lessons it contains for workers and youth today, can only be truly appreciated if we place it within the context of the present situation. And so I want to open my remarks by dealing with some very essential points about that. The imposition of authoritarian and fascist forms of rule is a clear and present danger, not only in the US, but internationally, as decisive sections of the bourgeoisie conclude that having created the most staggering levels of social inequality in history, this is the only way to maintain their rule. At the start of 2020, the World Socialist website published a perspective entitled "The Decade of Socialist Revolution Begins." It reviewed all the accelerating and intensifying contradictions of global capitalism, the ever-growing mountain of debt and fictitious capital expressed in the rise of the stock market, completely divorced from the real economy, the growing existential threat of climate change, the rise of social inequality, the decay of bourgeois democracy and the growth of authoritarian and fascist forms of rule, the deepening antagonisms between the major powers and the ever-growing danger of world war with potential nuclear consequences. The perspective did not predict the onset of the pandemic. We don't claim to have a crystal ball. But when COVID-19 struck, the International Committee of the Fourth International explained what its essential role would be, that it was a trigger event that would set off, intensify, and accelerate all the contradictions within global capitalism. That has surely come to pass. We need only to pose the following questions. Why, with all the resources available, is the pandemic continuing to race out of control? Why has the distribution of vaccines turned into a shambles? Why, in the face of what is clearly a global crisis, in which there is no national solution, is there no coordinated international response? The answer to these questions is to be found in the fact that an effective response to the pandemic, based on science, is headlong into 2 foundational contradictions of the capitalist mode of production: the subordination of all aspects of social life to the dictates and demands of corporate and financial profit, and the division of the world into rival and conflicting nation states. And now another great shock, arising directly out of the first, as Cheryl has explained, has been delivered in the form of the fascist coup attempt in the US on January 6. Now, the reaction to this shattering event has seen the opening of a chasm between our party and every tendency we have characterized as the pseudo-left, the nature of which it is vital, I think, to understand. On the basis of evidence, the volume of which grows every day, we have made clear that this attempted coup was backed by considerable sections of the political establishment, centred in the Republican Party and the state apparatus. It was undertaken with a definite objective, that the taking of the capital and the holding of hostages would change the facts on the ground, open the way to halt the ratification of Biden, and create a state of emergency where the result of the election would be overturned in some form. Now, those who maintain that this is far-fetched cover up what actually happened and are also blind to the lessons of history. After all, Mussolini's march on Rome in 1922 was not the great glorious event as presented in fascist mythology, but very much a shambles, but which nonetheless resulted in the king calling on the fascist leader to form a government. The pseudo-left around the world, from the DSA in the US, Red Flag in Australia, the Socialist Workers' Party in Britain, along with many others, have responded with one voice. Nothing to see here. It was not a coup attempt. It was a piece of theatre. And above all, bourgeois democracy remains strong. Their overriding concern is to prevent the working class in the US and internationally from grasping the historic significance of what has taken place. Now, why is that? The answer is not to be found simply in their mistaken conceptions and wrong ideas. It is rooted in more fundamental issues. It arises from their class orientation and, flowing from that, their entire political practice. All the work of our movement is directed to the development of the political consciousness of the working class in order to mobilize it to take state power in its own hands as a necessary first and foundational step in the reconstruction of society on socialist foundations. At the center of this fight to develop political consciousness is the exposure of the real nature of the capitalist state through the destruction of the mythology that surrounds it. Namely, that the state is somehow a neutral body standing above society, regulating it in accordance with the will of the people as expressed in elections, and revealing that when class tensions and social contradictions become extreme, the bourgeoisie moves to dispense with the facade of democracy and impose dictatorship. In opposition to this perspective, all the pseudo-left tendencies, whatever their tactical difference, are united on one central point. They reject the revolutionary role of the working class and consequently are hostile to the struggle to raise its political consciousness to enable it to carry out its historic tasks. But they do carry out political work, claiming to one degree or another to be opposed to the depredations of the capitalist system and to be seeking social change. But rejecting the revolutionary role of the working class, their politics is based firmly on the acceptance of the permanence of the capitalist state. So their politics consists of manoeuvres within its framework, the promotion of various sections of the labour bureaucracies, the claim that if only enough pressure is applied to various capitalist parties, they can be made to shift in a progressive direction. And above all, the claim that identity, race, gender, sexual orientation, etc., not class, is the fundamental question. And this politics is embedded in definite material interests, the gaining of wealth and influence within the existing capitalist order. And so today, when the real nature of the capitalist order is so starkly revealed, they react as one as if touched by a hot poker, and seek to chloroform the working class to which they are organically hostile. Now, notwithstanding the efforts of the pseudo-left, the experience of the pandemic and now the January 6th coup have resulted in a great shock within the working class. The key political issue of the hour is this: how and by what means can the build-up of mass anger and hostility in the US, Europe, Asia, Australasia, all over the world be forged into a comprehensive political program and movement to lead society out of the catastrophe now unfolding? Unless that is done, as the events of January 6 make clear, another solution to the crisis will be imposed. No answer is to be found from the existing organisations. Not only do they have no opposition to the devastation being unleashed, they are the most active and decisive mechanisms in enforcing it. Here we come to the importance and significance of Barry Jobson's life and struggle. He was a pioneer, a forerunner of the struggle that must now be undertaken by workers themselves to build the Revolutionary Party and resolve the crisis of working class leadership. His life and struggle was an expression of the role of the individual in the historic process. And above all, the power attained by individual workers in the struggle of their class when they join the Revolutionary Party and take up the fight for its program. Marxism explains that socialist revolution arises out of objective processes and contradictions within the capitalist system. But it has nothing in common with fatalism. Socialist revolution does not arise as a result of cosmic forces operating over and above society. No, it develops through the struggle of real living men and women who recognize, basing themselves on the tasks that the objective crisis of capitalism has presented, understand what must be done, undertake an active political struggle to educate others, and thereby become a beacon of light, showing the way forward. This was the basis of Barry's decision to join the International Committee of the Fourth International, the World Party of Socialist Revolution. It is a very important point in his political biography that he joined the revolutionary movement in 1974, shortly after the election of the Whitlam government, Labor government, in December 1972, when there were still illusions generated by the minor reforms it had initiated. Like many others of his generation, Barry had developed a deep sense of opposition to the Vietnam War. But for those who came to the revolutionary movement, there was always a more profound issue: what the war said about the whole history of capitalism. Barry began his political life in the Labor Party and was an important figure in that party in the working class suburb of Villawood, where he lived. So much so that when the elite barrister Neville Wran was seeking endorsement for the working class seat of Bass Hill in 1973, on his way to becoming state premier in 1976, it was Barry who introduced him to workers in the area. But very rapidly, Barry developed a class hostility to Wran and what he represented. In his decision to join the Revolutionary Party, he understood that class anger and hostility to the Labor bureaucracy and its role were not enough. He recognized he could not fight as an individual, but only as a party member, guided by a scientifically derived program continually renewed and developed through the collective struggle of a world party to assimilate the strategic experiences of the international working class. He understood this required reading and studying the works of the Marxist movement. Now, that presented problems for him because, like so many of his generation, his impoverished background had affected his early education, particularly his reading and writing skills. His response to that situation contains important lessons for workers and youth coming forward and joining our movement today. The deficiencies of the present education system, the denigration of history, the retrograde influence of postmodernism and its denial of objective truth, and its emphasis on identity politics confronts many young people with difficulties, particularly in grasping the broader historical processes on which our movement is based. So to those who feel that difficulty, I would say, take a leaf from Barry's book, Fight to Overcome Those Problems. In Barry's case, that involved a decision to go to night school, to develop the necessary skills to undertake the reading and comprehension of the works of Marxism and the history of the Trotskyist movement. And he developed a very powerful thirst for knowledge. Having undertaken that work, he was always full of questions and discussion. He had a particular interest in questions of political economy and philosophy, and I can recall discussions with him on the latest trends and developments in the global capitalist economy, issues he would later raise in discussions in the workplace. The crucial role of the labour and trade union bureaucracy as the central prop of the capitalist state was to be strikingly revealed not long after Barry joined the SLL, in the events of November 1975, when a coup was carried out by the Governor-General to remove the Whitlam government that had been returned to office in 1972 and again in May 74. As in the coup which had taken place in Chile in September 1973 and was still fresh in consciousness, the key role in this operation was not the power of the capitalist state as such, but the suppression of opposition in the working class by the Labour, Stalinist and trade union leaderships. It was most clearly articulated by the then ACTU leader Bob Hawke, who, when asked on the afternoon of the coup whether the trade union movement would be calling for strike action, and there was a powerful movement for a general strike, responded that it was necessary for leadership, that we were on the edge of something terrible, and the danger was the unleashing of forces the like of which we have never seen. For the Labour bureaucracy, the greatest danger was not the actions of the capitalist state and the ruling class, its readiness to tear up the foundations of democracy, but the intervention of the working class as an independent political force. The most significant development of the 7 years of the government of Malcolm Fraser was the preparation of the Labour leadership for its return to office. This was acknowledged, in fact, by Fraser himself in a perceptive comment after his government had been resoundingly defeated in the elections of March 1983. Asked what had been the major achievement of his government, Fraser replied, it was the change it had brought about in the Labour leadership. This change involved the complete abandonment by the Labour and trade union leadership of its program of social reform. And that change was driven by vast shifts in the global capitalist economy. The post-war boom had come to an end, and having managed to ride out the revolutionary storms of the period 1968 to 75, kept in power by the betrayals of the Social Democratic and Stalinist parties and the trade unions internationally, the bourgeoisie launched a global offensive. Spearheaded internationally by the Thatcher and Reagan governments, it was prosecuted in Australia by the Hawke and Keating Labor governments. The very first action of the incoming Hawke government, before the new parliament had even been convened, was to organise a tripartite conference comprising the government, the major business organisations and the trade unions to establish the Prices and Incomes Accord. This program involved not just the cutting of real wages, that was only its starting point, but centrally involved the destruction of all independent organisations of the working class. Under the developing globalisation of production, the unleashing of free markets, and the rise of finance capital, the trade unions were transformed. Their limited program of reform was scrapped as they became the chief instrument for the suppression of the working class to make Australian capitalism internationally competitive in the new world of globalised production and finance. This period of Barry's life was bound up with the struggle against this offensive, both at his workplace, Elcar Railway workshops, and in the broader labour movement. And Comrade Terry Cook will further elaborate on this work and the lessons to be drawn from it. I would just make 2 points. First, the historical record shows that the Hawke-Keating Labor government laid the foundations for the ongoing onslaught on the working class over the past 3 decades and more. Today, the Hawke-Keating era is regularly invoked in the financial media as the template for what must be done as the problems and crises of the capitalist system continue to mount. The second point is that the only consistent and coherent program to advance the working class against this offensive was that advanced and fought for by our party in the metal industries, in the postal service, in the building industry, in steel, among teachers and public sector workers, and of course, in the railways. In the midst of these struggles, there arose another decisive, indeed existential question. The leadership of the World Trotskyist movement, the International Committee of the Fourth International, had been in the hands of the leaders of the British section, the Workers' Revolutionary Party, Jerry Healey, Michael Bander, and Cliff Slaughter. This was on the basis of the struggle that they had waged in the 1950s and 1960s for the program of Trotskyism against the retrograde theories of Michel Pablo and Ernest Mandel, that the socialist transformation could be carried out by forces other than the working class, either by a section of the social democratic and Stalinist leaderships or by petty bourgeois nationalist forces such as Fidel Castro. But by the 1970s, increasingly in the 1980s, this leadership was headed in the same opportunist direction, adopting entire slabs of the Pabloite perspective against which it had previously fought so intransigently. This was intimately bound up with a descent into nationalism, the hallmark of all opportunist tendencies. The opportunism of the WRP led to the eruption of a crisis in the autumn of 1985. The International Committee, under the leadership of David North, the National Secretary of the Workers' League, who for the previous 3 years had developed a thorough critique of the opportunist line of the WRP, intervened. North's critique provided the basis for rallying the International Committee, including a section of the WRP, on the basis of the program of Trotskyism. The old leadership of the WRP broke into various opposed factions, but whatever their differences, they were united on one point. The International Committee had failed. The Trotskyist movement should be liquidated forthwith. Now, the renegades of the WRP found support within a section of the Australian Party, but they were defeated decisively, with Barry Jobson standing with the internationalists in the fight for the program on which he had joined the party. The crisis in the WRP, produced by the growth of nationalism, was an expression of broader socio-economic developments. The globalization of production, advancing at an increasingly rapid pace, had rendered utterly bankrupt all national-based programs and perspectives. Nowhere was this crisis expressed more sharply than in the Soviet Union and the regimes of Eastern Europe, in which the ruling bureaucracies were based so directly on the nationalist Stalinist dogma of socialism in one country. Faced with a growing rebellion in the working class and fearing it could be swept away, the Stalinist bureaucratic caste under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev made a preemptive strike. It liquidated the Soviet Union in 1991, restored capitalism, and transformed itself into a property-owning ruling class, along the lines of which Trotsky had warned in his masterwork, Revolution Betrayed, published in 1936. But of course, in response to this development, the mass media, the lecture halls of the universities, the intellectual symposia were not filled with articles and reports on the far-sighted character and brilliance of Trotsky's analysis made 53 years earlier and the extraordinary power of Marxism as the method of scientific analysis that it demonstrated. Of course not. Rather, there was an outpouring of triumphalism. Socialism had failed, Marxism was dead, capitalism and its so-called free market was the only possible and viable form of socio-economic organisation. Any review of the past 3 decades has revealed to the world what the triumph of capitalism has brought about. Endless wars, death and destruction, and now the emergence of a real fascist threat. This historic event, the liquidation of the USSR, had a major impact on the workers' movement in every country. There had been a rising tide of class struggle at the end of the 1980s, but then it stopped dead amid a wave of pessimism and confusion. After all, if the gains of the October Revolution could not be defended, then what could? Broad sections of the working class, even those who did not consider themselves to be socialist and even regarded themselves as right-wing, had understood, at least at some level, that whatever gains they had made were bound up with the remaining legacy of the first successful workers' revolution. The continued existence of the Soviet Union constituted in some way a warning to the ruling classes that they could only go so far. Now that barrier had been removed. Barry Jobson was deeply embedded in his class and for a period of time succumbed to this wave of pessimism, but not for very long. The Marxist explanation provided by his party, the International Committee of the Fourth International, that this development did not signify the end of socialism, much less the death of Marxism, but was the initial expression of a deepening crisis of capitalism, and that the contradiction between the global character of production and the nation-state system that had erupted in the Soviet Union would produce a series of revolutionary explosions in the capitalist system international. He resumed his place in the work of the Fourth International. The liquidation of the Soviet Union and the confusion it produced strengthened, however, the hand of the ruling class and their agencies in the labour movement, and they were able to carry through the closure of the Elcar workshop, plans for which had been in the making for some time. Barry moved to the Newcastle region and developed his work in the party. In 1998, with the development of the World Socialist website, he found a new outlet, becoming a writer for the site. In later years, now well into his 7th decade, he was particularly active on the Newcastle University campus, fighting to build the youth movement of the SEP, the International Youth and Students for Social Equality, a subject about which Comrade Max Boddy will speak. In concluding my remarks, let me point to the lessons from his life, which I believe that Barry, as a revolutionist, a Trotskyist, and an internationalist, would want to draw. To his fellow workers, he would say, study and learn from the lessons of history and join the Revolutionary Party, because it will provide you with the necessary weapons to fight for the emancipation of the working class and all humanity. And to the youth, faced with a future of devastation under capitalism, I know he would say, turn to the study of Marxism, read, study, and learn, and above all, turn to the working class and strive to arm it with a revolutionary perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Comrade Nick. We have now participants in the meeting from 8 different countries, as well as the countries that I've already mentioned, which was Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, the US, Canada, Brazil. We also have participants from Sri Lanka and Britain, as well as, throughout Australia itself, throughout the country, different areas, including regional and some remote areas. So again, I welcome all those participating throughout the world and also within this country. Our next speaker is Comrade Terry Cook. He too was a founding member of the Socialist Labour League and he has worked as a professional revolutionary on the staff of the party and the what was Workers' News. He is also a writer on the struggles and the experiences of workers throughout the country for the World Socialist website. And as he will outline, he worked for many years in the railways fighting with Comrade Barry for the program and perspective of the International Committee and of the working class. But it has to be said that he and Barry were part of the struggle of the party, both in Australia and internationally, who were fighting for this perspective. Comrades such as Ken Mantell in the building industry, Comrades Warwick and John Christian in the metal industry, Comrades Sue Phillips, Frank, Will, Margaret, and others in education, Comrade Chris in the tramways, and of course the late Comrade Keith James in Australia Post, were to name but a few, who fought for the political education and clarification of the working class under really what were very different circumstances. In the period of the 70s and 80s, it was one where the Stalinists of the Communist Party of Australia had the leadership of large sections of the unions, as did the Labor Party. Our comrades fought in the most principled and intransigent struggle against these political enemies, against their betrayals, and to fight for the greatest level of political and socialist consciousness within the working class. I am very pleased to introduce Comrade Terry and welcome him to this meeting.
Thank you, Comrade Cheryl. Comrades and friends, not only, of course, in Australia, but now internationally, I'd like to welcome you to this meeting. I had the privilege of collaborating politically with Comrade Barry Jobson over the course of some 40 years. He was my comrade and he was my friend. Over the greater part of these years, especially when we worked together in the electric car workshops, there is Elcar in Shallora, Sydney, we held discussions on an almost daily basis that invariably centred on the means to develop and advance the struggle for a revolutionary socialist consciousness among rail workers and amongst the working class more broadly. I wish to refer to the statement published on the World Socialist website on January 4 by Comrades Joseph Keyshaw and David North that draws the profound lessons of the strategical experiences of 2020 that in every aspect confirms the ICFI's characterisation of the last year as marking the beginning of the decade of socialist revolution. The comrades then state, the challenge that confronts the socialist movement in the context of the objective crisis of capitalism and the growth of a class struggle is to raise the class consciousness of the workers and impart to their movement a socialist direction. But this task does not consist simply in giving advice to workers from the outside. The success of the struggle for socialism depends upon establishing a powerful presence of the Socialist Equality Party in the factories, schools, and job sites of every section of the working class. In this context, the decades-long struggle conducted by Comrade Barry Jobson under the guidance of the party to bring the programme of the Fourth International into a key section of the Australian working class contains important lessons, I think, for our struggle today. Before relating some of the important experiences of that work, I would like to refer to some of the attributes of Comrade Jobson that I believe reflect all that is best in the Australian working class. We point out in the obituary published on the WWS on December 15, that Barry joined the Socialist Labour League, the forerunner of the Socialist Equality Party, in 1974. Now, he did so against the prevailing illusions in the working class surrounding the Labour government of Whitlam and the programme of reforms it enacted after being swept into office in December 1972 on the wave of an upsurge of the working class that was part of the resurgence of the class struggle on an international basis. In France, in 1968, this upsurge reached revolutionary proportions. In 1974, a coal miners' strike in the United Kingdom drove the Heath Tory government from power, and right-wing dictatorships fell in Portugal and Greece. Moreover, I think it's important to point out that Barry joined the SLL just 2 years after it was founded in 1972 as a section of the International Committee of the Fourth International, re-establishing, after a period of nearly 20 years' absence, the presence of a genuine Trotskyist party in Australia. The Trotskyist Party that had previously existed had been liquidated after 1953 under the influence of Pavlovism, a tendency that had emerged within the Fourth International in the post-war period that rejected the need for the construction of parties of the Bolshevik type that had led the Russian Revolution and dismissed the working class as the social force for the achievement of socialism. Barry, like other class-conscious workers who came to the party around that time, was not attracted because it had large membership or it commanded, substantial material forces, or because it could provide a pathway to a lucrative trade union or political career, a path that, given his capabilities, would have been open to Barry. He joined the SLL on the basis of agreement with its revolutionary socialist principles, program and perspective, and he was prepared to swim against the stream to fight for them. And that is a quality that is essential for a revolutionary fighter. The party was able to explain the counter-revolutionary role of Stalinism, the pro-capitalist role of labour reformism, even its left variants, and Pavlovite revisionism that provided a left cover for such forces. The party insisted that the struggle against capitalism and its ideological domination over the working class and for a socialist consciousness takes place in the relentless struggle against all these political props and agencies in the workers' movement, so to develop an independent political position and orientation for the working class. However, this fight, it explained, can only be conducted on a scientific understanding of the class character of these forces, which can only be required through a study of the strategical lessons of the class struggle over an entire historical epoch that are embodied in the program and history of Trotskyism. It's been pointed out that determined to equip himself to undertake this complex study in order to educate himself as a revolutionist, Barry Jobson decided to go to night school to overcome the deficiencies in his early formal education, a task which would be difficult and for which required a considerable amount of guts. When Barry, who already held an executive position on the Elcar Australian Railways Union sub-branch, made the decision to join the SLL, it opened up an avenue for the party to build a base in an important section of the working class. Understanding this, the party decided to commit further forces, and I joined Barry in the rail in 1976. This turn towards railway workers was part of an international initiative by the International Committee and its sections to utilise every opportunity and the important forces that have been won to make a decisive turn to the working class and extend the influence of Trotskyism. On this basis, the SL began important work, as Comrade Cheryl said, amongst teachers, carried forward by Comrade Sue Phillips, that won important support and adherence. Through the work of Comrade Keith James, we established a powerful base amongst workers in the Redfern Mail Exchange. Later, through the party's continuous and principled interventions into the struggles of the working class, we won important forces in the construction industry. In 1992, when Comrade Ken Mantell joined the party, and amongst metal workers from workplaces such as Comrade in 1983 and in the industrial New South Wales Illawarra region between 1985 and 86. When Barry and I began our struggle in Elcar, as did comrades in other areas, we did so with a profound understanding of Stalinism and left labourism, whose forces dominated across the railway workshops at the time. We understood, and we told workers, in order to take their struggle forward, they must know who their enemies are in the workers' movement. Behind a smokescreen of left posturing rhetoric, accompanied by intimidation when they met opposition, these forces worked to subordinate the then existing extensive job organisations, such as shop committees, to the trade union bureaucracy, and through this to the pro-capitalist agenda of the Labour Party. There were many important struggles that we conducted in Elcar and in the Shallora area in opposition to these forces to expand the influence of our party and to hammer out an independent road for workers. However, I would like to deal with the fight conducted by the party against one of the most important and significant assaults on the Australian working class, in which Barry played an essential role in mobilising rail workers. This assault was launched by the Hawke-Keating Labour governments from 1983 to 1996 and was to lay the basis, as Nick's pointed out, for the ongoing attacks on both Liberal and Labour governments ever since, including bringing into being a draconian industrial relations system that are today used to straitjacket workers' opposition to the attacks on jobs, working conditions, and workers' rights. This assault was part of an international counter-offensive by capitalism against the working class that followed the betrayals by Stalinism and social democracy, carried out with the aid of the Pavlovites of the revolutionary upsurge of the working class between 1968 and 75. As Nick said, what was done by Reagan in the United States that opened up with the operation to smash the strike by the PATCO air traffic controllers in 1981, and by Thatcher in Britain, led to the smashing of the 1984 miners' strike, was carried out by Labour in Australia. The vehicle for this capitalist offensive in Australia was the so-called Prices and Incomes Accord, a tripartite agreement between the Labour government, employers and the unions. Under this arrangement, Labour and the union bureaucracy began the attack to dismantle the hard-won conditions of previous decades, the breaking up of the most militant centres of the working class, and the elimination of any organisational expression of workers' democracy or even nominal independence, in particular in the major workplaces. This assault could only be undertaken because of the critical support provided by the Stalinist and Labour lefts in the unions, particularly in the metal trades and the Building Workers Industrial Union, that not only worked to blind workers to the class nature of the accord, but were also the shock troops to intimidate, threaten, ostracise, and viciously attack all who opposed it. From the outset, the SLL opposed the accord and all that flowed from it: award restructuring, Australia reconstructed, two-tier wage trade-offs, outsourcing and privatisation. Elcar, because of the work of the SLL, was an important centre for mobilising the political opposition in the working class, but also to defend all those workers targeted by Labour and the union bureaucracy. The party's determined struggle against Labour and the ACTU and their Stalinist supporters over time began to change the relationship of forces in the railway workshops and other sections of the working class towards the Socialist Labour League and its class perspective. This fight, however, was being undermined by the degeneration and drift to opportunism of the Workers' Revolutionary Party, the then British section of the ICFI, to which the young party in Australia looked for guidance. This served to weaken and disorient the essential struggle in Australia against the Labour lefts and the Stalinists. Following this historical struggle that led to the split with the WRP in 1985-86, and then once again placed the great historical revolutionary heritage of Trotskyism at the very centre of the ICFI, the SLL began to develop the necessary tactics and responses to deepen the fight against the left's props of the Hawke government. For example, in 1987, a mass meeting at Elcar endorsed a resolution moved by Barry and myself in line with the position developed by the SLL to demand the calling of an emergency Labour Party conference to expel the Hawke-Keating right wing and to fight for a workers' government to implement socialist policies. This call that won support in important sections of the working class where the party had supporters were firmly and determinedly opposed by the Labour left themselves and by the Stalinists. A similar resolution put by young SLL metal workers that won substantial support the same year at a mass meeting in the New South Wales Illawarra region, and this was done in the teeth of opposition of so-called left trade union officials and the less Labour MP and Pabloite George Peterson. Then in 1989, a mass meeting of Elcar workers endorsed a resolution rejecting outright the ACTU's Accord policy and instructing the shop committee to use all means at its disposal to mobilise opposition throughout the union movement to this historical assault on the conditions, living standards and basic rights of the working class. And on this basis of this support, we were able to take this fight into other sections of the working class across the rail and more generally. Now, always at the centre and the very centre of the fight conducted by Barry and the SLL in the railway workshops was always the crucial question of internationalism and the need for the international unity of the working class. Well-attended meetings were organised in Elcar and other railway workshops to be addressed by speakers from sections of the International Committee. Visits included leading members from the SEP in Sri Lanka to gain support for its campaign for a united front against the JVP's fascist attacks on the working class, and from the SEP in the United States to rally support for victimised US Greyhound worker Roger Cawthron, and US Workers' League 1992 presidential candidate Ellen Hayard also came to speak to us. However, one of the most important aspects of the fight for internationalism takes place on the question of war, to develop an independent position of the working class, and this has to be done against the national pressures that are generated by capitalism and their agencies in the workers' movement. It was on this basis that the Trotskyist Elcar, as part of the fight of the ICFI, began a struggle to mobilise workers in rail in opposition to the First Gulf War in 1990-91. That was supported by the Hawke Labour government that had dispatched Australian naval forces to the region. We held workshop meetings and forums to explain to workers that the Gulf War marked the beginning of a new period of colonial conquest and imperialist intervention led by the US that would inevitably be undertaken by every other major imperialist nation. We won support for the ICFI's call for the convening of a World Conference of Workers Against Imperialist War and Colonialism held in Berlin in November 1991, and Elcar workers gave donations to fund myself to attend that conference as a delegate. Similarly, in the Redfern Mail Exchange, money was raised to send Comrade Keith as a delegate. The resolutions passed at that conference to mobilise the working class against this drive towards colonialism were discussed and endorsed at workshop meetings after receiving report backs. As part of this, a march organised by the SLL in opposition to war that traversed through the major working class suburbs in Sydney was the precursor to such actions in other capital centres, was endorsed by the Elcar Shop Committee. This march started at the Elcar workshop gates with a large meeting of workers addressed by SLL speakers, including Comrade Barry. The president of the shop committee, a Stalinist, who was instructed to convey to the march the workers' support, but was terrified of being questioned on his party's support for that war, went absent on the day. The impact of the betrayals and defeats inflicted on the working class over this period, including the liquidation of the USSR by Stalinism in 1991, led to disorientation and retreats, as Nick said, in the working class internationally. However, the ICFI drew the necessary lessons to arm the new forces that would eventually come forward to consolidate the gains of the party and to prepare it for the next period of struggle. Rosa Luxemburg once said of the working class, historical experience is its only schoolmistress. She continued, its thorny way to self-emancipation is paved not only with immeasurable suffering, but also with countless errors. The aim of its journey, its emancipation, depends on this, whether the proletariat can learn from its own errors. And it can only do this, of course, with the aid of the Revolutionary Party. We have now entered a period of renewed upsurge of the class struggle in the international working class and of a decade of socialist revolution that provides the basis for the building of the international committee in every country to lead this fight. We can do no better, I think, to honour the memory of Comrade Barry Jobson than to take up the struggle with the renewed effort to which he dedicated his life, and for those who are not yet members of the SEP to join today and take forward the struggle. Thank you.
Thanks, Comrade Terry. I think that some of the points which Terry has outlined and the struggles which the International Committee were undertaking in this period really is of enormous importance and significance. And I think Comrade Barry would be gratified to know that his memorial meeting, that the meeting to honour his role, his legacy, would also be the basis on which the education of younger comrades on the history of the party, both here and internationally, is being carried out. In that sense, our final speaker, Comrade Max Boddy, who was elected the Assistant National Secretary of the SEP at the last Congress in 2020, is a representative of that new generation, the younger generation, for whose political development and recruitment Comrade Barry played a decisive role. Comrade Terry and Barry, who, as Nick has outlined, by that stage were now living in Newcastle, and they represented the older generation of the party. Nevertheless, they both intervened onto the campus of the University of Newcastle. They did so in order to build the Club of the International Youth and Students for Social Equality and to fight for the re-establishment of the branch of the SEP in that extremely important working class area. Comrade Max met the comrades in the course of those political interventions, and he is the product of that struggle. And so I would like you to welcome him and introduce him warmly as the last speaker to our meeting today.
Thank you, Comrade Cheryl. As with the other speakers, I would like to welcome everybody from across the globe for participating in this important meeting today. The work of Comrade Barry in the latter portion of his life was integral to my political development, as with a whole new generation of Marxists. The intervention of worker revolutionaries like Barry, who fought against the numerous petty bourgeois ideologies vigorously promoted at universities, was critical in the establishment of the party's presence on campus. I first met the party in 2010, in my second year of university. I was 20 years old at the time, and like millions of other young people, my political consciousness was shaped by the near decade of unending wars waged by United States imperialism and its allies. I vehemently opposed the continued military occupation on Afghanistan, which was launched in 2001, but most etched in my mind was the criminal invasion of Iraq in 2003. From the beginning, the lies of weapons of mass destruction did not hold any weight. Like others of my generation, I knew this was a war for control of oil and territory. When the truth about the non-existent WMDs came to light, it solidified in my mind that US imperialism and any government who supported the war could not be trusted. I was also shaped by the numerous images and videos of the brutality and barbarism of the war that slowly surfaced, many of them released to the public by WikiLeaks, including the horrors of the CIA torture site of Guantanamo Bay. In 2007, the year I turned 18, I cast my first vote for the Labor Party of Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, believing that Rudd would end the wars overseas. How wrong I was. Indeed, the Labor Party deepened and extended Australia's involvement in the criminal interventions of the United States. Following this experience, I began searching for a political alternative. This initially led me to sign up to the mailing list of the pseudo-left Socialist Alliance on Newcastle campus, but I found them politically unattractive because of their lack of organisation and jumping from protest to protest with no clear line. And then a friend told me of the meeting of the IYSSE on campus in 2010, telling me that this was the party I was looking for. I attended the meeting, listened intently to the report. What gripped me was the class analysis and historical perspective that was presented. The insistence on the importance of history and study meant that at the conclusion of the meeting, I purchased 3 books and resolved to attend the next meeting. It was there that I met Comrade Barry for the first time. I learnt that Barry, along with comrades Noel and Terry, had been campaigning for some time on Newcastle campus to build the IYSSE. This was part of a broader turn by the party internationally. Similar clubs were established across Australia, the United States, Sri Lanka, Germany, and the UK. This orientation was a critical component of the transformation of leagues into parties. It is the identification of the need for the development of socialist consciousness in the working class and a consistent turn to the younger generation of workers and students. It was recognised that the universities were being transformed into the ideological factories of postmodernism, identity politics, and the post-Soviet school of historical falsification. The fight to build a student club on campus meant an intransigent struggle against these conceptions and a fight against the political proponents of these reactionary ideologies on campus. Now, Barry understood that critical to the demarcation of our party from that of the pseudo-left was the importance of studying and assimilating the writings of the Marxist movement and grasping the strategic lessons of the 20th century. This is what struck me the moment I met him that day. The meeting was being held to promote the newly published and first edition of In Defense of Leon Trotsky, a book written by Comrade David North in response to a new campaign of historical falsification of Trotsky's name, this time led by Oxford University professor Robert Service. Barry was keen to speak to me. He had in his hand a copy of the book and asked me if I had purchased one myself, which I had. Barry said that was good, as it was important that I begin to build up my own Marxist library. He then asked if I had read the book and what I thought about Trotsky, to which I confessed I'd only just started, but that Trotsky appeared to be an important figure in history. At that point, Barry insisted, in his usual soft but firm manner, that I must read it cover to cover, before engaging in an in-depth discussion about Trotsky's importance and his role in the Russian Revolution. This was a significant moment in my political development and represents the role of the older generation of comrades that they had on new and younger generation. Here, a worker revolutionary who had fought to learn to read at night school in order to assimilate the lessons of the party was stressing to a young second-year university student the absolute necessity of carrying out a serious study of history. It was something I knew he insisted on with all young students, and is why, as we wrote in his obituary on the World Socialist website, he was often asked by students which department he lectured for on campus. I recall again another meeting in 2010. We were holding specifically to differentiate ourselves and the other club, the Socialist Alliance on campus, whose youth movement, the Resistance, had been on campus prior to our club's foundation. At the meeting, a student from Resistance attended, clearly with the intention of defending his organisation. In the question and answer session, he initially fought to defend the role of the Democratic Socialist Party, that is the DSP, who later merged into the Socialist Alliance, in calling for Australian troops to be sent into East Timor. To give some background, in 1999, the Indonesian government brutally invaded East Timor after a referendum vote calling for their independence. The Australian government, who had a long record of intimate collaboration with the Indonesian regime, made military preparations for invasion prior to the independence vote being taken. After violence escalated following the vote, pseudo-left groupings across Australia organised demonstrations demanding Australian troops in, under the fraudulent claim of a humanitarian imperialist intervention, a clear oxymoron. Many of the groups and individuals who were calling for troops in were the same that had, decades earlier, been opposing imperialist invasion into Vietnam. This new call was an expression of the transformation of this layer of the upper middle class into open agents of imperialism. The troops in protests provided the crucial political cover for the Howard Liberal National Coalition government to launch their imperialist invasion. Far from defending innocent people, Australian troops did not arrive until the worst of the violence ended and sought only to secure control over the multi-billion-dollar oil and natural gas reserves beneath the Timor Sea. Now, initially at the meeting, the Socialist Alliance representative tried to defend his position, saying it was to save women and children. However, once the history of this episode was made clear to the audience of students, he responded by saying, well, we may have got that wrong. He never accounted for how such an incorrect political position could be made. I remember that after the meeting, Barry spoke to me and said our party has a clear record and position on East Timor. We exposed the role of the East Timorese nationalist groups, the CNRT, which refused to defend the population, and we outlined a socialist perspective for the East Timorese. Barry said the WSWS does not have to retract one sentence on this question. This was pivotal. It made clear to me that the Fourth International was the only party of world socialist revolution and exposed the rotten politics of the petty bourgeois pseudo-left. It was work of this nature that established our club, which now exists as the Socialist Club on the campus at University of Newcastle. These same pseudo-left groups who called for the imperialist plunder of East Timor are now saying the events of January 6th this year are nothing but a farce, claiming the attempted fascist coup presents no danger to the working class. They are seeking to chloroform workers, precisely because the events at the Capitol building raises the necessity for a mass movement of the working class to combat the fascist threat. The work of Comrade Barry, a worker revolutionary who fought to educate students on campus, was crucial for the recruitment of a new generation of Marxists in Newcastle. Barry brought the political lessons and experiences of his work with the party at Elcar onto the campus. It is now the responsibility of this generation of revolutionaries to continue and deepen our turn to the working class. These new students, having been educated by worker Bolsheviks, must now turn to the factories and workplaces to recruit new worker revolutionaries to this movement. This is part of the legacy of Comrade Barry Jobson that must be assimilated by all young people and students coming into this party. Thank you.
Thanks, Comrade Max. At this point of the meeting, we would like to open it up for any questions. In those important struggles against the Labor bureaucracy, Stalinists and pseudo-lefts for an independent position for the working class, was the struggle against syndicalist tendencies particularly difficult in the fight to demarcate Trotskyism within railway workers or other sections, particularly with respect to the type of party workers needed? I think this was directed at Comrade Terry, but I think it could be answered by any of the speakers.
I'll just make a couple of remarks on this. I mean, it's important because I think in the course of the work of the party, many workers would look upon our party as the most kind of left expression, in a way, of militant struggle. And as a type of, to bring a left pressure on the established parties and leaderships of the working class to push them to undertake more militant campaigns to oppose the attacks on the past gains. Now, we would explain that this was not the role of the party, and that a struggle was needed. The struggle that was needed for workers to understand was that it must be guided by an understanding. No matter how militant the struggle is, it must be guided by an understanding that none of the great issues facing the working class, the question of war, breakdown, a never-ending assault on its social position, could be resolved unless the working class takes up its historical role for the taking of power. I mean, a lack of this understanding and errors made on this understanding has cost the working class dearly over a whole protracted period. I mean, its failure to take forward the struggle or the defeats that was inflicted on it, and its inability to overcome those, to take forward the struggle for the socialist overturn of capitalism in the whole period of the 20th century has led to disasters. As Nick outlined, you know, the coming to power of fascism in Germany, and of course, you know, everything that flowed from that. So, and it's been demonstrated. None of the issues that rose in the period that we worked in the Elcar workshops and in the working class, none of these issues have been resolved. They now raise their heads again in this period. The drive to war is now being faced by the working class again. The deepening inter-imperialist antagonisms that could lead to a catastrophic development and war with China and Russia, nuclear armed nations, and also, of course, you know, the threat, as Nick had pointed out, of the rise of fascism and the threat of fascism once again. Now, how can this be resisted on the basis of syndicalist struggles to add one kopeck to the other, as Lenin would say? No, what the working class must begin to do, and this is always a struggle, there's always the pressure on revolutionaries is from its peers and from those sometimes who are closely supported in the working class areas, is not to bring these politics into the working class. That, you know, trade unionism and syndicalism had to dominate. And of course, you know, we fought against this, and it was a difficult fight. And we fought against those pressures to mobilize workers on an entirely different and on a revolutionary political perspective. So I think I just wanted to begin the answer to that question on that basis.
I'd just like to make a couple of points, if that's all right, Cheryl.
Yep, go ahead.
I recall in the revolutionary upheavals in Spain in the Civil War, 1936 to 39, the defeat of which was, of course, the precursor and made inevitable, as Trotsky said, the outbreak of World War II because of the defeats of the working class that had taken place internationally. Trotsky said there were three things that were needed in Spain.
A party, a party, and a party.
That's right, Terry. A party, and a party. Now, what did he mean by that? He meant that the fundamental task of the working class is not to develop its militant struggle, not to develop, resistance to capitalism. That will come and that will develop. But the question is, where is this movement to go? The historic task of the working class is not to put pressure on the bourgeoisie to force it to retreat and try and make some gains. The role of the party is to mobilize the working class to seize political power. And Trotsky once said, for that seizure of power, an instrument is needed and has to be forged and has to be developed. The working class can't simply grasp political power in its bare hands, so to speak, unconsciously. It must have a party that trains and educates the working class in all the vicissitudes, the twists and turns, the efforts of the bourgeoisie and all of its agencies to derail this movement, to siphon it off. And we see that taking place today. In the midst of, in the immediate aftermath of this fascist coup, we see all these agencies come forward to try and blind and chloroform the working class as to the real meaning of these events. Now, the understanding of what has taken place in society, the relation of class forces, the complex relations between different sections of the bourgeoisie, the role of the pseudo-lefts, the role of the trade union bureaucracies, the role of the Democratic Party or the Labour Party, that can only be grasped with a scientific understanding, which is only developed through a revolutionary party. There is no other way. And syndicalism, of course, has ended in a blind alley. The historical record shows that it's only in the Russian Revolution, the only and so far successful socialist revolution where the working class actually took power, that is the crucial factor. The absence of such a party in all of the struggles that emerged in the succeeding period was not, the result. The defeats were not the result of a lack of a revolutionary situation. They were not, those defeats have not been the product of the lack of a determination by the working class to fight. That exists in abundance, and we're going to see it, and we already have in the developing movements over the past decade, enormous struggles developing. But until a party is constructed, capable of organising on a scientifically worked out program the taking of power by the working class, then the working class cannot be successful. And another program is imposed. That's what's at stake in this question. There is no substitute. And of course, it does involve the struggle for the development of the political consciousness does involve a political fight against all of these theories, some of which sound quite militant, but all of which, come to bear to divert the working class from its essential historic mission, which is not to fight for a increase in living standards as such, but to understand that it is the bearer of a new social order, that its historic mission is the overthrow of the capitalist system, the capitalist ruling class, and the establishment of a new basis of society based on the common ownership of the means of production, based on production for need, not for profit, based on the conscious scientific organization of social life, the development of science to guide mankind's activity in this increasingly complex world. What is the barrier to that? It's the profit system. It's the holding of the levers of power by the capitalist class that must be torn from them. And that can only develop through the struggle of the working class, conscious of its role under the leadership and guidance of a revolutionary party. And that party will not emerge spontaneously. It emerges by workers like Barry Jobson making the decision on the basis of the analysis of the party that they must join it, that a particle of the fate of humanity rests upon their shoulders, as Trotsky said, and that they must undertake this fight. That's the issue that confronts the working class today. And unless that is done, unless a party is constructed capable of leading the working class to take political power, then we know the lessons of history. Another solution will be imposed. Camp Auschwitz, as one of the fascists in the capital had it on his T-shirt.
There are actually quite a few questions that are coming in, so I'll move on to those. Can someone speak to the attraction socialist internationalism held for workers of Barry's generation and social background? And how do you deal with cynicism? Sort of a related question, I guess.
Well, on the question of socialist internationalism, I think, one of the things that attracted Barry was a very staunch opponent of the Vietnam War, which was opposed around the world, and there was was attracted on that, on that basis. The other, I think, decisive question is, of course, the growing internationalism is not some holiday speechifying. It actually is the political expression of organic tendencies within the world economy itself. The working class is now, to a stage never before seen in history, an international class, a class which is integrated by the very nature of capitalist production itself, by the common experiences of workers, by the development of the means of communication, by the development of migration. The enormous changes which have taken place in the composition of the Australian workforce, where you have workers in one factory or a school or a university probably come from 50, 60, 70, 80 countries of the world. You may have that in one workplace or one area of work. So I think this is an important and powerful, development, which of course strikes objectively at the very basis of all capitalist ideology, which is to seek to tie the working class to the outmoded framework of the nation state. And after all, as we explain, if the world economy can be organized as it is by vast transnational corporations which transcend borders, barriers, which organize production, their finances on a global scale, then it can certainly be organized on that basis by the working class. And as for the question of the cynics, well, we leave them to their fate, I think. We explain the issues to them. If they're not convinced, well, events will convince them. And maybe others, of course, will, and you'll find this very, very directly, they'll pass from their so-called cynicism, nothing can be done, and so on and so forth, and it's all, they, of course, will become very directly embroiled and involved in become direct and open agencies of the bourgeoisie. That's the record of the past, it's the record of the present. And so we have to make very clear to them as we encounter them that that's the direction they're heading and that they should change their orientation.
Okay. Another question. To what extent can Trotsky's analysis take into account the relationship between class struggle and the evolutionary evidence behind human behaviour? How is it possible for the movement to integrate this context into the direction towards successful revolution?
The ICFI and Marxists, we are materialists. Our understanding of the development of consciousness of man is based on, external factors. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what the person who's referring to is it the evolutionary the evolutionary evidence behind human behavior. But, most of the time when we encounter the question of human behavior, it's with the conception that, men and women are inherently greedy, inherently self-centered and focused on individuals. And that is why, a revolution that's about the emancipation of all mankind, it would not be possible. I think it's interesting that this question has come up within the context of Barry Jobson, because I do recall in some of the campaigns I would have with Barry, if that was brought up, which was relatively common in the early days, his response would be to say, well, that's fundamentally a religious conception of original sin. That is that, man is born evil, therefore, man has no way forward. Look, the thing is, the objective developments of which we have gone through today, and I think Nick, outlined quite concretely, as well as Cheryl in his opening, in his remarks, these developments will have a profound impact on the consciousness of millions of people. My development, which was a reflection of the development of, millions of other young people, of the unending wars, it will shift the consciousness of masses. They will enter into struggle on this basis. There is not going to be, I think the other point that it comes back to is the conception of what creates a just man. And it's an old, there would always be the argument in philosophy, what creates a just man? Well, a just society has to create a just man. But then how do you create a just society? Well, a just man creates a just society, etc. But Marx answered this question. In the process of transforming society, mankind, the individuals who are participating in it, themselves become changed. So what we're talking about here is a profound shift in consciousness. People will begin to break with the old, political organizations that hold sway. They will begin to understand that what is confronting them is not just one or another political party, but the entire system itself, and will be looking for answers. But the crucial question here, and Nick went through this before, is the absolute necessity of a political party that intervenes into these struggles, that develops the consciousness of workers and makes clear that the path is international socialism. So, that's how I begin to answer that question.
I just want to say a couple of words, and I agree with Nick on this question of this traction of socialist internationalism. It held for workers like Barry's generation and from his social background. Well, the truth is, there is an unconscious striving for socialism in the working class. Of course, this is stifled, misdirected, by the intervention of the current leaderships. The poison of nationalism is pumped into the working class by the labour and trade union bureaucracies and other agencies day in, day out, in order to tie it to the capitalist state and to the interests of their own ruling classes. But this striving then begins to meet up with the actual developments, as Nick says, in a globalized economy. There is a sense in the working class that their struggles, and he doesn't, only have to read papers, they see it on televisions now, that their struggles are similar to those of workers in other countries and around the world. And in many cases, they are exploited by the very same corporations and conglomerates. Now, this is becoming ever more clear to workers, and did come ever more clear to workers under conditions of the globalization of every aspect of production. It has been internationalized, and all the old national-based productive processes have been dismantled. Now, every aspect of production in which workers engage ties them immediately to workers in other countries across the world. So the party has been making this clear the other issue, and one only has to look at this striving, this attraction of internationalism to workers when it's explained to them by the fact, for instance, the struggle of the British miners against the Thatcher government was applauded across the globe by workers. They were all facing the same type of attacks, the destruction of conditions, etc. And there was a certain joy that a powerful section of the working class, like the miners, was taking a fight to the representative of this in Great Britain, and hoped for the victory of that struggle because it would strengthen them. Now, the defeat of that, you can see, had an impact on the working class. I remember I was at a mass miners meeting up in the Hunter Valley. And this was after the defeat of the miners meeting. They were bringing in 12-hour shifts and the dismantling, 7-day work and dismantling of, historical conditions that have been won by the, determined struggle of miners throughout the whole year. And a miner got up and said, basically, screw this. We should take a 2x4 out to this government, he was talking, and, fight it to the death. And the trade union official got up and just said, excuse me, brother, if the British miners can't do it, what hope do you have? And immediately a silence descended on that meeting. You could see that this defeat for the working class in another country had this profound impact of rolling back the struggle of a powerful section of the working class in Australia. So, of course, we have to bring our understanding of internationalism. And the other question, of course, on the question of war. I mean, the question of war mobilized and radicalized a whole section of youth and also industrial workers who came out not only in this country, but other countries to oppose their own imperialist class and its intervention into Vietnam, and to give support to the struggle of the Vietnamese workers and peasants. So I think, that's my answer to that.
All right. There is a question that asks whether one of the speakers explained the political significance of the strike statistics graph shown in Nick Beams's contribution. And I think a related comment or question is the Elcar workshop sounds like it was a relatively stable workplace where staff could collaborate and build a revolutionary culture over time. How can we respond to the growth of the gig economy and the many workers whose work lives are much more transient?
Well, the strike figures in what I raised, I mean, you see a high, I don't know if you can see it on the graph, there was a very major upsurge of the working class in 1974. I think it was the highest strike movement, highest level of strikes since 1919 in Australia. We've only got there 1980 to 2020, but was the highest level since 1919 in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. And one of the key questions that was drawn by the Labourites after they were ousted by the capitalist state, they had a whole discussion about, well, what had gone wrong? Why weren't we were accommodative? We weren't a dangerous government. We weren't particularly left-wing. Where did we fail? Why were we thrown out of office? Why did they remove us? We were loyal servants. And they concluded that one of the problems was, of course, and one of the things they didn't measure up to, was containing the upsurge of the working class, which had developed in that part of the 1970s, and resolved to correct that. And over the next 7 years of the Fraser government, developed and discussed the means and the mechanisms to ensure that that never happened again. And determined right from the outset, when they were returned on the wake of a major upsurge of workers' struggles, which I think you can see in 1980, 1981 on that graph, a very big upsurge. I think we had some pictures of it. Strikes in Wollongong, occupation of mines, against what was at that point the biggest devastation of jobs since the Great Depression. And the Hawke government came to power on that wave of opposition. I mean, it was a foregone conclusion that the Fraser government was going to be defeated in 1983. As Hayden said, a drover's dog could have led Labor to victory in that election. Such was the hostility to Fraser. The government virtually collapsed. But the central task of the Laborites, and why the Accord was so important, was to develop the mechanism for the straitjacketing of the working class. And that proceeded brutally and forcefully. And it reached its peak in 1989. There were two major developments there. One was the bringing out of troops against the pilots to ensure that who had gone outside of the Accord to break their strike. There was the occupation of Cockatoo Island dockyard against closure, and this was used, and this was a continuing against which we fought. There was a continuing development of, the closure of militant sections of the working class, sections where it had a base of support, like Elcar, Cockatoo Island, other industrial workplaces, Comenge, for example, in the railways. Major centres were closed down, shut down, and so on, in order to prevent the growth of militant opposition. And where there was resistance, such as, for example, at the aircraft factory Hawker de Havilland, where they said, we're not going to dissolve our shop committee. We don't agree with this accord. We think shop committees should fight for workers. They came in, the bureaucracy came in, the Stalinists in the lead, to shut it down. So this is the product of this campaign. This was not some automatic process. This was this decline in the industrial movement of the working class under conditions where wages were going down, conditions were being eroded, social inequality was increasing, the complete suppression of the working class. Now, how is a new revival going to be developed of the class struggle, of the struggle of the working class? Political struggles, industrial struggles, only through the development of a new leadership. I think that's the lesson to be drawn from this graph. The revival and development of the working class as an independent force, as an independent movement, requires the development of a new leadership and requires the development of many, many Barry Jobsons in the workers' movement. So I think that's one of the lessons to be drawn from that. The questions of the gig economy, well, new forms of organisation have to be developed. The gig economy is a product of the development of social media, of the internet, and so on. And of course, to meet this new situation where we don't have the same conditions as we had 30 or 40 years ago, we've got to develop new methods, and we're seeking to do that on the internet, in various groups, in discussions, and giving rise to different forms of organisation.
Comrade Nick has gone through, I think, some of the essential points. I mean, this graph is a naked demonstration of how the trade unions have turned into open agents of imperialism, suppressing the class struggle. And this will have a profound, and is having a profound impact on the consciousness of millions of workers and young people. The level of union membership now is at all-time lows. In the public sector, it's slightly higher than the private sector, but they're very, very small. Young people in particular are not members of unions. And there's a significance to it. Comrade Terry and Nick, but Terry went through the struggles against the trade union, conceptions amongst workers, Stalinism, etc. These were the old props of capitalism that suppressed the consciousness of workers. Those, in essence, don't exist as they have before. The pressure that they exert on the working class have shifted, and in young people in particular. And this was in fact anticipated by our party. We recognise that the shift and transformation of these layers required the formation of a political party. That's part of the transformation of the Socialist Labour League to the Socialist Equality Party, to be a mass party of the working class. It was also behind the orientation to young people and students, because it was a recognition that the young people, this new generation, would face the absolute brunt of this. and it's expressed in the gig economy. Many, many young people are in the gig economy, or have casual work that is almost equivalent to being in the gig economy. You only get work when it's available, etc. It is, not to mention the numerous workers who now have to be sole traders, essentially sort out their own insurance like a mini business. I mean, this is critical, but while at the same time, I mean, one maybe, it's not the same as a factory of thousands of workers that used to exist, but it does come with it a new question. I mean, it raises the question of the class struggle to a higher level. How are Amazon workers or Uber workers to organise? I mean, they are not confronting just, say, the trade union bureaucracy in Australia or the factory owner in Australia. They are confronting, an international ruling elite that is seeking to carve from their backs ever greater levels of productivity. In that sense, it points very directly to these workers, young workers in the gig economy, etc., the question of internationalism. And that will have an impact on their consciousness. The forms of struggle will, in that sense, assume an international character, and necessarily will have to, because of the nature of this type of work. So, I think, I think the question in that sense is saying, well, it's not the same. There's not big factories where you can get, it does pose problems and development of our work, but it also raises some of those fundamental questions to a higher level in the consciousness of these workers and young people. Anyway, I just wanted to make that point.
Thanks, Max, and thanks to the other comrades. I know that we could continue the discussion for much longer, but we have been going for almost 2 hours, and I think if there is participants who want to continue the discussion with our comrades, please feel free to write in. We can undertake and we can organise to ring you, to visit you if possible, and to continue the discussion. But I think on the points which comrades have raised, and in particular in that sense expressed in the strike and industrial relations figures, there have been decades of damage to the consciousness of the working class undertaken by the combined forces of Stalinism, social democracy, Pabloism, the pseudo-lefts, those forces in the trade unions. And I think it is expressed in that sense very sharply in the fact that there is really not yet a clear understanding by broad sections of the working class, either in the United States or really in any other country, of the profound implications and dangers of the attempted coup that has been carried out on January the 6th. The preparations, it is absolutely clear, are underway for another attempt, either on January the 20th or possibly on another date. And certainly one of the comments that was made in the chat in the course of this meeting is that Hitler actually was not successful in his initial putsch in 1923. It was defeated. He went to jail. But what emerged 10 years later, and that was also a different period, is that he was then Vice-Chancellor in 1933. The ruling class turned towards Hitler under conditions where the crisis was deepening, and the necessity most profoundly to deal violently with the working class with the working class was necessary. It is the raising of the consciousness of young people, of workers, which is essential. And that is, as comrades have outlined, bound up with the role of the party. What is the legacy of Comrade Barry Jobson? What is a worker Bolshevik? In a nutshell, it is somebody who has dedicated their lives to the development and building of the alternative revolutionary leadership in the working class in order to lead the inevitable struggles which will be carried out by the working class to what is the historic task of that working class, and that is the overthrow of capitalism. What did Barry do? What did our other comrades do? What does the party do? It provides the truth to the working class. It provides an understanding of what is taking place, but also why it is taking place. They differentiated themselves from the filthy nationalism of the trade union bureaucracy, from the political positions to tie the working class to parliamentarism of the Labourites, the Stalinists who paraded under the banner of socialism in order to carry out the betrayal of the struggles of the working class in the name of socialism. And what Barry was able to do, what he fought to do, was not just to explain and oppose, but to provide an alternative, a road forward, the answers, and a clear political perspective. That is why our movement in the United States has called for a public and open investigation into the attempted coup of January the 6th. It is so important that this is taken up, and that part of that is the fight for a political general strike against the preparations of the ruling class and their fascist backers for further attacks and further coups. Knowledge is revolutionary. If anybody has followed the persecution of Julian Assange, then nothing could be more profoundly drawn out than the treatment of this journalist, of this man who provided information, not just to the ruling class and the political elite, but most importantly, to the working class, to the masses. And he has been persecuted for over a decade for carrying that through. The same with Edward Snowden. Truth is revolutionary. Knowledge is revolutionary. And I think to emphasise the points that have been made, unless the working class intervenes into this political situation in its own independent struggle, in its own independent interests, then other forces, more reactionary, right-wing, and in fact fascist forces, will carry through their own agenda. And just in summing up, one of the points which Comrade David North raised in a meeting on the 20th anniversary of the assassination of our comrade Tom Heenahan, which was carried out on October the 16th, 1977. In 1997, Comrade North raised, and he was talking about what it was that attracted Tom Heenahan to the Workers' League, which was the predecessor of the Socialist Equality Party. And I won't read the whole thing, but I will just raise some of the points. As he says, just as the character of a person is expressed in the philosophy he adopts, an individual reveals in the choice of the party the forces, ideals, principles, and aims that motivate him at the most profound level of his intellectual and moral being. And then he goes on, the revolutionary movement is a great fisher of men and women. It seeks out those who have the capacity to rise to the level of the most difficult of historical tasks, who are prepared to devote to the socialist cause not merely months or even several years, but decades and even a lifetime. It demands of its members exceptional powers of intellectual and moral endurance. Those who are seeking only superficial answers to the problems of this world will choose a party that makes few demands upon their intellect, that offers easy and reassuring answers to complex problems, that adapts to the prevailing prejudices of public opinion and so-called common sense, and that denies the depth of commitment, intensity of struggle, and theoretical labour required for the revolutionary transformation of society. Superficial organisations attract superficial people. And as Comrade North went on, one thing that Tom Heenahan was not was superficial, and one thing that Barry Jobson was not, was superficial. What Max outlined in his discussions, in his interactions with Comrade Barry, is Barry's insistence to read, to draw, and to know the strategic experiences of the working class, the lessons of the struggles, the courageous and tragic struggles of the working class. Our movement is one that appeals to the intellect of young people, to the intelligence, to the brains of the working class. Our movement fights to base our analysis in history. In order to understand what is taking place today, one has to understand what has gone on in the past. And so in concluding the discussion that we've undertaken, I want to point to the audience the Maring Books site, the website, and just a few of the texts which we have on offer. They are the historical and international foundations of the SEP Australia. This document was adopted in January 2010 at the founding of the Socialist Equality Party in Sydney. And it examines the critical political experiences of the Australian working class through the 20th century in the context of the historical struggles of the working class internationally and the context of the political, social and economic situation. The other pamphlet actually is the Industrial Relations and the Trade Unions under Labor, from Whitlam to Rudd. This was a pamphlet which was written by Comrade Nick, and it is a history of the political experiences and attacks carried out by the representatives of the Australian bourgeoisie, and most significantly in that the role of the Labor Party as the main and consistent bulwark for the defence of Australian imperialism. It also provides the analysis which the SLL and the SEP undertook in the course of these profoundly important political experiences of the working class in this region. The other texts which I'd like to convey and commend to comrades is A Quarter Century of War, the US Drive for Global Hegemony. This is a compilation of the essays and lectures delivered by Comrade David North, the chairperson of the International Editorial Board of the WSWS and of the US SEP. And it goes through, in the course in particular from 1990 to 2016, of the unending wars conducted by US imperialism to overcome its decline in economic and world hegemony, as well as, of course, the growing domestic crisis and the attacks which part and parcel of these wars abroad were being carried out against the American working class. And finally, the 2 volumes of Why Study the Russian Revolution. These were lectures that were presented by leaders of the ICFI in 2017 on the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution of 1917. For the first time, the working class under the leadership of the Bolshevik Party of Lenin and Trotsky overthrew capitalism in a country of 150 million people. It established the first socialist state in history. It proved that this task could be carried through and how it was carried through. This event was the most consequential, the most important event of the 20th century, and it has a burning contemporary relevance. The 2 volumes are both very accessible outlines of what was a complex, contradictory and very explosive period of the developing movement of the working class, certainly in Russia, but also throughout Europe. So I would ask that you go to the Maring Books site, use the links that are available to purchase these books, and in so doing, begin your study and your comprehension of the tasks which now confront the working class in the 21st century. In doing so, I also want to raise that you support and provide to the party the resources necessary for us to carry through this extraordinarily, historically important task. We appeal to you, our members, our supporters, our listeners, to provide our party with the resources necessary to carry out this great task which we have before us. We know that you have donated to our regular monthly fund on an ongoing basis, and we very much appreciate and thank you for that, but we ask for more, and we do so without apology. It is only to the working class that we receive and access the resources necessary. We do not get state funding, we don't get sponsorship from any section of government or of corporations. We rely upon our support from the working class. So in asking you to do that, and we will keep the meeting going after we conclude in order that you're able to carry through these donations. And also just to remind that if you are listening from overseas, then please donate to the World Socialist website, to the website, because it is illegal under the reactionary electoral funding laws in this country for anybody outside Australia to donate to an Australian political party. So if you are residing, and if you do reside in Australia, please donate to the link which is provided for the Australian SEP, if not for the World Socialist website. And in completing this meeting and in finalising this meeting, I again call on you and join with my comrades to restate yet again that if you are not yet a member of the Socialist Equality Party, please make the decision to join. The working class is made up of individuals. What individuals do matters. Individuals can make decisions, and we are raising urgently the necessity for anybody who is not a member of the SEP to indicate and to make the decision to join this party, to take your place in the fight for the resolution of the crisis of revolutionary leadership, to build sections of the International Committee where there are not yet sections, and to help grow areas and sections where they do exist. This will be the most important decision of your life. And in doing so, it will emulate the life, the struggle, and the legacy of Comrade Barry Jobson. Thank you for your attendance, for your questions, for your participation, and I bid you a fond farewell.